Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit series video from the subreddit HFY, called Contact Procedures Volume 8 Chapter 9, written by MeatFcker. The link to the original will be down below, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. TAV Dewdrop Soul. The last time Tweety had left Soul, his wing hadn't ached and he hadn't had a view. Instead, he'd been dressed in full-powered armor and bundled into a cramped troop ship with the rest of his platoon. The troop ships had been hidden in the cargo container, and the cargo container had slipped onto the interceptor compact freighter. Then they spent a week urinating in catheters and vying for the 2 square meters of deck space filled with crash couches and weapons. It had been miserable, but at least there had been a promise of return when their operation was over. They'd known that they could come home. This time the fleeing Terrans had no such guarantee. They might never return to Sol, or they might return too late to save anything. The view was pretty, though. The Dewdrop rode near the back of the Terran formation, and the bridge's main view screen showed most of the fleet. Civilian ships were highlighted in green, armored naval auxiliaries in orange, and warships supported with deep crimson outlines. Watching the fleet move was like staring down at the grip of a blood-tipped spear, aimed at Soulgate and launched with the force of an entire species. There were thousands of ships in the formation. Tweety could pick out the odd vessel built in the blocky compact style, rather than the sleek predatory shapes the Terrans favored. Those were the remnant flock ships, once more fleeing a defeated system. He still didn't know how many Neji had made it off Mars, but he wasn't about to look. This evacuation wasn't about any one race. It was about the Terrans. Behind them, a handful of civilian ships separated the Dewdrop from a small rearguard of heavy cruisers. The warships were manned by volunteers, and they were only line of defense against the pursuing replicators. Few of them were expecting to make it through the gate. Combined the footprint of more than 4,000 impeller drives, it was hard to mask. They'd caught the attention of the swarms orbiting Earth, Mars, and even the pockets that were about to break through the belt. When they slowed for the final approach, their pursuers would overtake them. The rearguard wouldn't be enough, they'd be overwhelmed, but they couldn't spare any more of the remaining warships for the rear. There were replicators waiting for them at the gate too. Roughly a third of the invading force had never ventured into the solar system, content to buzz around the gate like a giant swarm of locusts. When they sensed the fleets approaching, they formed up into a wall. Every surviving Terran dreadnought was clustered at the spear's tip, ready to carve a path through the vulnerable civilian transports. Auxiliary forces, little more than merchant vessels with private yachts that boasted anti-piracy weapons, would try to stop the replicators from closing back in, and the rearguard was already seeding mines behind the fleet. With luck, they would get most of the arcs through the gate. If not, there wouldn't be much of a human race left to mourn their failure. Unnamed cutter, Sol. The bridge of Marshal Colonel Cole Weber's cutter was spotless. In the 7 hours since he'd volunteered to become the biggest mass murderer in the history of mankind, the only thing that he'd been able to do was clean, methodically scrubbing and sterilizing every surface in tiny craft. He figured that by now the floor would have had to be used for surgery. He also thought that he needed another pass. He was parked in a dangerously low orbit around the sun, breathing out the skin suit's air bottle. Every system on the cutter had powered down save 2, a hardline communications link with his payload, and a lone console to show the results. Weber was powerless to stop his gaze from drifting towards the display, or to stop himself from reading the same line of text over and over again. Weapon armed and awaiting command to fire. There'd be no redemption for his crimes. Millions, perhaps billions of humans had hidden themselves throughout Sol. His wife and daughter had never made it off Mars. Thanks to him, they'd die. The hundreds of thousands of humans fleeing the system did so with dim hope, however slight, of return. The Council would dangle that carrot out in front of the civilians to urge them forward. The Admiralty would rally the cries to take back their home system, to charge back in and rescue their trapped brethren. Thanks to him, they'd lie. They wouldn't be so knowingly, of course, but the men might not see it that way. If the chairman's orders ever came to light, it could rip the Terran alliance apart. Weber didn't worry about that now, though. They had stopped the pursuit, yet they had to leave the fleet hope. That meant that they had to use the weapon. Weapon armed and awaiting command to fire. Weber rose from where he'd been scrubbing the deck plating and walked back to the bridge. Behind the crash couch, he should check the lubricant on the seats gimbling again. That was important. It was, of course, pure coincidence that he couldn't see the display from here. Arc-124 Sol. Kyla shifted her toe claws around, desperately trying to settle them into a comfortable position. It was a damn EVA boot. She grabbed her fitted gloves as a way of evacuating Dallas, but it hadn't occurred to her to pack shoes. Askren weren't very much for footwear. Kyla had been forced to cram her massive shovel-like feet into the largest pair of human boots that they had in the emergency locker. They felt about as comfortable as the bear traps that she'd seen in human history books. She'd already triple-checked her equipment. Thick, heat-shielding coveralls snugly secured over a form-fitted vac suit. Emergency rebreather clipped securely in place on her belt. Fusion torch tucked into the next to it. And a full seal on her suits, from her snout to her triple-toed feet. Goddamn boots! She fidgeted her toe claws again, then slumped her head in resignation. She'd just have to get on with it and live with the itch. Kyla was skimming through the Ark's floor plans, ensuring that she had to commit it to memory, when she noticed her human partner frowning down at her. What was his name? Bruce? Boromir? No, that was the name of a human story. Benny? That didn't sound right. Damn, these humans and their endless names. The man had rattled more than 8 syllables when he had been paired, and Kyla had tried to fix all 3 in her mind. She barely held on to the first letter. "You're sure you're up for it?" he asked. "There's no shame in backing out. This jump's going to be hard on the Arks." His tone was kind, but Kyla still bristled. Typical human. Just because he was taller, faster, and a good bit stronger than her didn't mean that she couldn't carry her weight. Try burying a human under half a ton of dirt. See if you could dig themselves out before suffocating. Or try stuffing a hood onto one of their heads, spinning them around and tossing them into an unfamiliar room. Fat chance that they'd be able to stand up, avoid obstacles, and calmly walk back to the door. Her partner, Brian, cleared his throat, and Kyla realized that she'd completely forgotten about his question. She forced her thoughts into the line of hastily stitched together response that carried all the deliberate weight of the gravitas of Askren's speech. "Huh?" she blurted out. Kyla winced. That was bad, even for her. "The rescue duty," replied her partner. "Everyone here is a volunteer. Nobody expects you to stay if it gets too much for you." "It's not," she said. "I learned from the best." She left it at that. The man wasn't kin and had no right to expect anything more from her. Any certs to back that up? No offense, but you're short, slow, fluffy. Forget discretion. She was angry now, hasty. Aldister Fields would have pulled her out of the room, but he was safely ensconced in the Council Dreadnought. "My world's almost as high gravity as yours, and my species made our home under the hard soil for tens of thousands of years. We bounce when rocks hit us. We shift boulders for fun. Our warrens make your subway tunnels look like graph axes. Just because I can't beat you in hurdles doesn't mean that I can't shift a broken beam." Kyla stared up at her partner's surprised face and then added, "I am also a certified Class B emergency responder, and I graduated with distinction from the TAS Hesviestus, pre-enlistment SAR technical school. You know, the one that flunks out 2 in every 3 human enrollees." She paused, letting him process before continuing. "Is that qualified enough for you?" He nodded and extended a hand. "I think that we got off on the wrong foot. I am Benjamin Abelson Markovsky, engineer's mate of the TAV Iceberg. Well, the former Iceberg. She's scrapped now. Never made it out of Texas." Kyla grasped the man's hand in a shovel-like paw and shook it. His grip was firm, but she matched it. Barely. "I may have been a little blunt myself, and I am presently known as Kyla. Let me know if I get in your way. Something tells me that you're a bit more qualified than me." The Ark let out a steady groan as the inertial dampeners kicked in. They were slowing, dropping down to a transient velocity. Kyla could feel the deck vibrating beneath her and silently cursed whoever had decided to retrofit a 70-year-old Arks rather than build new ones. No amount of reinforcement could change the fact that they had been designed around massive rotating drums. She only hoped that the fleet's approach speed was on the slow side. Enough maps. Kyla lowered herself to a squat and closed her eyes. Deep breaths. Keep the heart rate down. With a bit of luck, nothing will go wrong and she wouldn't be needed. But if catastrophe struck, she would be ready. She had a debt to repay after all. HFY Machina Soul. Jenkins had to admit he was little impressed with the Machina and her captain. Charles was a blur of disorganized efficiency, prodding his 2-bridge crew from task to task, or running what had to be 2-bridge stations from his implants, and the ship itself, despite its age and apparent disrepair, kept pace with the dewdrop without the slightest sign of strain. If their weapon systems had similar upgrades, Jenkins and Walsh might get us out of Sol alive. The goat watched them all from the corner, chewing on a mouthful of cud. Jenkins could have set the clock by the creature's deliberate remunerations. "Approach vector locked," said Liam, beginning deacceleration to target velocity in 30 seconds. "What's the transition going to be like?" asked Walsh. 1,500 fricking kilometers per fricking second. Said Walsh. "That's bad," asked Jenkins. As part of their boarding training, every fleet marine had to qualify at least one shipboard trade. Junior ranks filled the more menial roles, while warrant officers and up learned bridge duties. Jenkins could just about pass for a competent at the TAC console. Walsh, for reasons only known to her, had opted for a far more difficult field of navigation. "Another couple hundred clicks faster and we'd come through as paste," replied Walsh. "The dewdrop will make it just fine, and this piece of crap should, but the arcs weren't built for gate transitions in mind. Could be messy." Charles broke in. "This piece of crap, as you so eloquently put it, will do fine. She's quite the ship." Before anyone could answer, the deep bass chords of the Machina's Grazer turret echoed through the ship. Jenkins sat bolt upright. "We're at the blockade already?" "No, but we just got overtaken by the rest of the swarm," said Charles. "There is a reason we're hitting the gate as quickly as we are. Here, let me turn on that station you're sitting at. See if that won't shut you up." "Like that'll work," muttered Jenkins. He turned his gaze to the cracked screen. What he saw there made him lose all desire to keep talking. The swarm had indeed overtaken the Terran formation, throwing themselves into the rearguard with a reckless abandon. The warships clustered at the back and answered their charge with grazers. Some replicator ships got through. The naval auxiliaries opened fire. They held back the swarm for 23 seconds, and on the screen Jenkins watched as the neighboring squadrons were overwhelmed, the captains detonating their reactors as writhing puddles of replicators overran their hulls. Neighboring groups of ships shifted in response. Sweat beaded down Charles's forehead as he nudged the Machina course out of the blast. They grew closer to the waiting replicator blockade. They punched through with a single violent outpouring of grazer fire. Replicator platforms swarmed in to plug the hole, but the leading dreadnoughts burned hard to slow their race towards the gate and screen the vulnerable civilian ships. The invaders died by the thousands. Machina did its part, accounting for half a dozen similar constructs. They were through in a heartbeat. Jenkins squeezed his eyes shut as he hit the gate. Unnamed cutter Sol, weapon armed and awaiting command to fire. Weber sat on his crash couch, both hands clenched into fists. His fingernails bit into his palms as his knuckles were white. His foot idly pushed a rag across the deck. Weapon armed and waiting command to fire. The text on the screen was no longer just a status report. It had become something more. An accusation, a demon, a promise of damnation. A small, unassuming grey button next to the screen stared at him with the fury of an entire race. When he woke, he'd wake in hell. His wife would be waiting there, and his daughter, and the billion other souls that would die by his hand. They'd flay him alive for all of eternity. Weapon armed and awaiting command to fire. 2 counts now ticked down below the console. One in green showed the number of seconds left until the last fleeing Terran ship cleared the gate. The other in red was the computer's best guess at how long he had until the replicators found him. 25 seconds in the green and 108 in the red. Weapon armed and awaiting command to fire. He cursed himself for offering to see this through to himself. It was his proposal, he argued, his project. He didn't know what the replicators were capable of, he said. Could they override a remote detonation signal? Could they destroy a fail-safe loop before it could trigger? Would they risk a weapon of this power in a simple timer? Weapon armed and awaiting command to fire. He'd quietly shared the plan with 7 other marshal engineers who'd worked under him. Young, smart, and unflinchingly dedicated to the survival of mankind. 2 months ago, they'd excitedly unveiled the first prototype, a scaled-up version of the technology of the compact had used to destabilize the core of Askra's sun. Their work had been simple. All they'd really had to do was build it bigger. None of them had gone in thinking that they were creating anything other than a super weapon, but they'd all rationalized it away somehow. For most, the implication that it would never be used against humans was enough. Hearing the plan had left them broken. As far as Weber was aware, none of them was still alive. Weapon armed and awaiting command to fire. 4 green seconds left. Weber's fingers hovered over the grey button. He tried to squeeze his eyes shut, tried to tear his gaze away, but he couldn't. 3 seconds. When he sent the command, the weapon would fire, pumping terajoules of energy into the sun. 2 seconds. The sun wouldn't collapse, its core wouldn't even destabilize. Instead, a unique gravitational signature would ripple out across the galaxy at velocities well beyond the speed of light. It would find the gate. 1 second. If the math was right, the gate would respond. It would try and launch the sun across the galaxy. It would fail catastrophically. The counter reached 0. He pushed the button with a shaking hand. Weapon fired. Somewhere across the solar system, waves of destruction started to pulse out of the gate. By the time it first reached Weber, the potency would have waned, but it would still dwarf for hundreds of solar flares being torn from the sun. Weber couldn't remember how long the first pulse would take to reach him, or whether or not the ship would be vaporized before Earth. He couldn't recall how long it would take before the sun restabilized, or whether or not the gate would eventually recover. Even the damage projections that they'd run for the Sol system escaped him. His forgetfulness didn't bother him, though. As soon as Weber's job was done, he reached for his sidearm like a drowning man grasping for air. TAS Relentless Midway. Rear Admiral Joseph Grant leaned forward in his chair, fingers steepled, and watched the Galactic Compact maneuver. There were 2 hostile formations, officially designated Bogey 1 and Bogey 2, but to him they looked like they're sharks who smell blood in the water. They could strike at any minute. They wouldn't, though, at least not while the Second Fleet had a Sling-class battlecruiser left. The ugly ships were a little more than an impeller drive bolted to a short-range accelerated cannon, but they were damned effective. When the compact had first poured through the gate and rushed at the Second Fleet, 4 slings had crippled 1 super dreadnought and left another drifting dead through space. Grant's dreadnought squadron and screen had hounded the wounded behemoth, their grazers widening the rents left by the gank cannons until the ship's mat and plant was exposed. The other squadron of stalwart-class dreadnoughts, under Rear Admiral Singh, had turned with the rest of the fleet to face the compact's next charge. Of the 2 dreadnought squadron commanders, Grant had gotten the better assignment. Singh had died in that charge, his ship reactor cracked open by the grazer's strike seconds after the screens failed. The crew on one of the other dreadnoughts had been forced to abandon ship, and Grant had lost 3 more while finishing off his target. When the Second Fleet turned to face the third charge, they hadn't expected to survive. Their tonnage had been reduced by half, with only 7 dreadnoughts left to break the charge. The last sling was hiding in the fleet's chop, preparing to fire off 1 last shot before they focused down on the compact screen. They waited. They braced. They prepared to defend the Sol Vector for the last. But then the compact hadn't come. The standoff had lasted for 3 hours, the compact unwilling to risk more than their super dreadnoughts and the Terrans too weakened to try a charge. The 2 fleets had been reduced to dodging each other's long-range grazer shots, hoping to score a lucky hit but mostly killing time. The Second Fleet had sent courier buoys through the gate, but they received no response. Grant had grown worried. Then the refugees fleeing Sol had arrived, confirming his worst fears. Evidently, the compact had been just as surprised as them when civilian ships started to pour through the gate. The hostile fleet had split into 2 formations, positioning themselves to intercept the Terrans well before they could build up velocity needed to jump retreat back through the gate. While Second Fleet and the meager reinforcements had placed themselves between the enemy and the remnants of mankind. Now Grant was left to wonder why the civilians didn't seem to be slowing down. The only thing the hastily written CUB had been able to say was technical difficulties. Whatever they were, they better be resolved fast. Every kilometer that they drifted from the gate only made it clear that the compact to trap them in the system. TAV dewdrop Midway. Tweety blinked frantically, trying to banish the post-jump nausea. From the corner of his eyes, he could see flaring, straightening up. Cromley was crouching at his station, and Calloway didn't look as if he'd noticed the transition. There was no replicators coming after them. The mine seemed to be working. "Compacts here," said Calloway. His calm voice contrasted sharply with the ice running through Tweety's veins. The Galactic Compact had attacked in force, with hundreds of cruisers and 4 ram-sized super dreadnoughts. No, 7 super dreadnoughts. 3 were drifting hulks that were too massive to do anything else. Those weren't the only ships venting atmosphere, though. Second Fleet was in tatters, their strength reduced a little more than a third. They'd formed up a ragged wall of shield the civilian fleet, and in the heart of the Terran formation, there were the Arcs. Tweety's crash dropped as he read the message on his screen. "Calloway, I just bounced our new orders over to you. Our squadron is to proceed with haste to vector near the edge of the Civi fleet and cut acceleration. We are also to advise all unarmed craft of our squadron to stand by and receive additional passengers." Why the change of plans? And where the hell are we finding extra passengers? "The Arcs," Tweety said. "Not all of them survived the jump." Arc-124 Midway. The jump had transformed the Arc-124 into a sanctuary to a hell. Thick, greasy smoke choked her shattered corridors, and almost every pre-contact system had failed catastrophically. Not the inertial dampeners, though. Those had survived the cushion the ship's re-emergence in Midway, and they were still projecting 1 standard gravity across the dying Arc. Kyla was gulping down water in the shuttle bay, steeling herself for the 5th trip into the chaos. When she noticed Benjamin arguing with her hangar chief, she dropped her small paper cup and shuffled over. "We don't have time," the chief was saying, exasperation playing on his smoke-stained features. "We're down to half a foot of this viz in the corridors, and the evacs cutoff is less than 7 minutes. Keep your sweep in near our ingress. Look for any survivors you might have missed. It's too risky to go any further." "I'm not saying that we need to go any further," said Benjamin. "Just that we need some heavy cutting tools to get through blockage at 23B. It's not even 200 meters in. Why the hell would you want to get through 23B? There's an occupied cabin on the other side. Not in our sector, but we're the only ones who can reach it. Give me 10 minutes. You don't have 10 minutes, you have 7. And by the time you've gotten the equipment set up, it'll be 1. Request denied. We need to cut our losses at some point." "I'm small. I can get through," said Kyla. Both humans turned to stare at her. "Which cabin?" 82389, said Benjamin. His gaze swept the hangar deck with a hunted for his helmet. "There's no freaking way you'll be able to get through," the chief said. "It's a fool's—" "Watch me," Kyla interrupted. She grabbed her respirator and goggles. During the jump, her helmet had been cracked clean in two after a brief but violent relationship with the bulkhead. Through the thick curtain, holding back the smoke. "We don't leave men behind." HAV Mechanica Midway. Charles was pacing across the small bridge. "How long do you expect us to wait here, soldier boy? We're drifting further and further from the gate. We should cut our losses and run." "And leave close to a third of the fleet's population in dead ships?" asked Jenkins. "Not a chance. We hold it until ordered to move." "But there's an opening. The compact won't chase down a lone fighter. If we leave now—" "Not a fricking chance," repeated Jenkins. "Don't ask again. That would make me angry." Arc-124 Midway. Kyla moved with the steady, deliberate of an askren. By now she'd memorized every twisted floor panel, each blown conduit, and every red-hot stitch on the deck. Finding her way through the bulkhead 23B was a fosterling's play. It only cost her 30 heartbeats. She ran her blunt digging claws along the blockage, feeding the gap as she remembered. It was half a meter above the ground, and just as wide enough for her to wiggle through. Kyla ducked down, fusion torch in hand, and she started to crawl through. Another 20 beats down the drain. Her makeshift tunnel came out at the end after 2 meters, blocked by a twisted reinforcement girder. Kyla's torch came to life and carved out a slice. She felt every second tick by. When the metal dropped off, the askran didn't wait for the edge to cool. She flattened herself and tried to wiggle under. She misjudged, not accounting for her bulky gear, and the glowing edge of the metal seared a line in her flesh, fur, and suit across her back. Her focus shattered for an instant. All she could think of was scrambling out from under the beam. She lost the count. Had 30 beats past 40? She couldn't tell. Hasty, she swore. Why do I always have to be so hasty? Kyla could feel her carefully ordered plan trembling at its base. Without the count, her deliberate advance felt more like a mad scramble. How would she pace herself? When would she turn back? She snorted at the thought she'd turn back when she was done. Not before. She owed that much. Kyla picked herself up, ignoring the new pain, and pushed onwards. This was new territory, new hidden obstacles that forced her to slow her pace. The Askren found her calm again, committing every step to memory. The cabin door was 38 meters from the rubble. Kyla started to work her way out of the corridor's edge into the 36-meter mark. It proved difficult. More than half the deck was still burned red-hot from the overloaded power conduits. The tips of her boots were singed from probing with the ground in the front of her. Kyla's gloved claws closed around the door's manual release and twisted. It stuck halfway. Wonderful. A few quick slices with the fusion torch drained the hydraulics and cut the lock out. She heaved the door open and sucked in a quick gulp of fresh, unfiltered air before the smoke could pour in after. The grandfather was slumped over a mangled emergency locker, unmoving. Kyla couldn't find a pulse. The granddaughter was sobbing in the corner. Kyla scooped up the child and, after peeling back the coveralls and skin suit, tucked the girl against her fur. The fragile human stared up at the Askran with wide, terrified eyes. Kyla knew exactly what to say. Slater had whispered the same words to her. Right after he bundled her up in his arms and placed his body between her and the wrath of her species' dying planet. "It's going to be okay," she said. "I've got you now. Nothing else is going to hurt you." HFY Mechanica Midway. Jenkins caught the motion out of the corner of his eye and sprang out of his chair, drawing his sidearm as he spun towards the mechanic captain. Cheeky bastard had tried to use the random pacing to reposition himself on the bridge. Charles's own gun had barely left its holster. Disbelief flicked across the overweight captain's face, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. He brought his weapon up with a shrug. "You needn't have bothered getting up," said Charles. "We don't want to hurt you. It's just that we don't feel like dying here and the fleet when it's clean shot of an escape. We'll drop you off at the first fringe port we find." He smiled apologetically. "Besides, you can't fly the ship without my implants. Shooting me won't do much good for you." Jenkins' eyes flicked over to Fingers and Liam, who had both risen from the seats and drawn holdouts. They were at his 4 o'clock, no way that he could cover all three. Charles was still in front of him, brandishing another of his pathetic little toys. Jenkins had carried a pistol like the one on Lotus. You were better off throwing the damn things rather than waiting for a second shot. Jenkins had an idea. "Fine," he said, "you win." He slowly lowered his gun. "No need for us to get violent in here." Walsh's elbow slammed into Fingers' throat as she broke Liam's wrist. Both men dropped their guns and gasped in pain. Jenkins smiled. She had a knack for fading into the background. He rushed Charles. The captain's gun went off, but Jenkins' vac suit had absorbed the shot. Well, most of it. It still punched a hole through his shoulder, but it didn't blow a whole joint apart. He slammed into Charles with his uninjured side, and both men down struggling. Something hard hit Jenkins's nose. He grunted with pain as it broke. Had Charles headbutted him? How could someone that overweight be this goddamn slippery? With his left arm hanging limp, he couldn't quite put his bastard into a hold. Instead, he kneed Charles in the groin. Hard. The Machinist captain groaned and then went limp. Jenkins disentangled himself and stood up. "Anyone else feel like breaking ranks?" he asked. "No? Good. Let's do this over again." He collapsed back into his seat, fishing in his belt for a field of nanites. Charles was still rolling on the ground in pain, face ashen. Fingers and Liam kept sneaking fearful looks at Walsh. Jenkins sighed. This was going to be a long trip. TAS Relentless Midway. The fleet was too far from the gate. Rear Admiral Grant kept staring at the plot, running vectors and escape routes in his head. The Midway gate could be used to reach other 4 systems, but as far as the fleet was concerned, it was nothing but a giant dead end. The compact stood between them and escape. No amount of clever maneuvering would stop their super dreadnoughts from tearing through the unarmed civilian ships. A quick glance around the room confirmed that his flag staff had reached the same conclusion. Commodore Yu, Commander Foster, and Commander Smith all stared dejectedly at the plot, and Lieutenant Tannis kept sneaking glances from the comm station. Major Hassanyi was lurking in the corner, staring down at 2 armed martial officers standing guard at the door. They were trapped. There was no way out. Unless... You, said Grant. How many of the old payloads do we have left? 1 per steward, sir, replied Yu. We had them fueled and ready for boarding up before the first charge, but they aborted. Aborted? Why the hell did they abort, and why didn't I hear about this? The ingress points that we used on the ram were blocked. Massive armored plates. And you were told, said Haransi. You had just more pressing concerns at the time. Grant frowned, thinking back. Yes, the Haransi had definitely delivered the report. That had been when he was absorbing the remains of Singh's dreadnought squadron into his own, though he hadn't paid much attention. My apologies, Major. It slipped my mind. But the main thing is that we still have stealth-capable shuttles that are flyable, right? Aye, sir. Excellent. Lieutenant Tanner's given me a direct line to Admiral Hugh. Grant smiled. I have an idea. Arc 124 Midway. Kyla scrambled through the smoke-filled corridor, barely managing to swerve around the countless obstacles that littered the floor. The return trip was proving far more difficult without the benefit of a respirator. She could feel the strain building in her lungs, hear some corner of her mind screaming at her to draw a breath. There was nothing like digging her way out of a cave-in, where every move was carefully planned and executed to use the barest minimal of effort. This was chaos. Kyla had no clue why she'd thought that she could make it back to the shuttle bay in one breath. The girl shifted against her chest, tickling her fur. And Kyla remembered. That was why she could do it. Take 1 step at a time, never stop moving forward. Slater had taught her that. This was just like the training course back on the HEF. Something caught her foot and sent her sprawling. Kyla got both arms out and caught herself awkwardly before she crushed the girl under her. But the impact broke one of the Akran's wrists. She bit down on her tongue to stop the scream and accidentally sucked in a bit of smoke. A cough ranked her body before she could stop it. Precious air slipped out. Somehow Kyla managed to get herself under control and hold in the last of her air, but there was still smoke in her lungs. The urge to cough was almost overwhelming. She held it back. Barely. Kyla heaved herself up with one good arm and felt a surge of relief when she made it out of the steady hiss of the girl's respirator over the pounding in her ears. The kid was still breathing. That was all that mattered. She probed drunkenly with a claw foot, tearing the path in front of her, and resumed forward to stagger. Her legs weren't quite behaving like they were supposed to. She tried to raise one up, intending to step over an obstruction, only to have it drag across the ground. The deck felt like it was swaying constantly, despite the fact that artificial gravity dampener still held. It was all that she could do to stay upright. 1 step, then another. Keep moving towards the shuttle bay. Fight back the urge to cough. If she stopped, the girl would be dead. Then suddenly there were hands gripping her, holding her upright, hauling her into the clean air. She blinked in surprise as the smoke vanished, then doubled over as the coughing fit that she'd been holding back burst out with a vengeance. Benjamin held her as she fumbled in a coverall zipper, exposing the girl's respirator masked face set to the bay. Come on, Kyla, we've got to go. He was gesturing towards the small cutter parked nearby. Rest of the evacs left. We can't hang back much longer. You, she gasped, stayed. Of course I did, said Benjamin. The man was grinning like an idiot. We don't leave Terrence behind, remember? TAV dewdrop Midway. New orders, Calloway, said Tweety. The fleet's going to try some maneuvers in 3 minutes. All vessels are to cut their mat and reactors and go dark for the designated time, and all ships with cold start capabilities are to make ready to perform jump start preparations. That's drastic, said Calloway. We'd better warm up the fusion bottle then. You'll pass the word to the engineering deck, right? Already sent the message. Of course you did. You and Edgy make a damn fine crew. Thanks, said Flaring. Any word on why we're killing the lights? Some scheme for Rear Admiral Grants. The bridge fell silent. Rusty rested his head on Tweety's lap and felt out a soft whine, and the Lenegini idly stroked the German shepherd's oversized head. Wasn't he the one who dreamed up the ship in a container plan that got us into Myla? Asked Cromley, his face frowning. Yeah, said Flaring slowly. Think so. Although he wasn't a Rear Admiral back then. He got a promotion out of the op, if I recall correctly, said Tweety. Well, I ended up with claustrophobia, said Cromley. Can't say that I'm too pleased that he's cooking something up with the entire fleet. "All of you quiet," said Cromley. He sounded nervous. "We're about to go dark." The artificial gravity cut out, the illumination died, the consoles went black. Then, a few seconds later, the fusion reactor kicked in and the lights returned. Although they remained weightless, Calloway breathed a sigh of relief. "That's the first time we fired up the fusion bottle," he said. "I'll be honest, I'm a little surprised that it didn't blow." TAS Relentless Midway. The Relentless's flagship felt lonely without Grant's full staff. Commander Yu and Ensign Parker had stayed, the rest had evacuated with the crew. Only a small skeleton crew remained on each of the dreadnoughts. Yu had draped over the common station's crash couch. Parker's head was buried into the access panel. Grant was brooding. "This had better work," he said. "It will," said Yu. "Your schemes always work." "They don't normally involve this many ships," said Grant, "and I don't think I've ever bet against the survival of the entire human race." There was a muffled squawk from the access panel as Parker popped out, face apologetic. "Sorry, sirs, brushed up against a live wire." "How's it coming?" asked Yu. "Almost done. The Rear Admiral's tablet will be wired in shortly." "It's starting," said Grant's conversation stopped as all three men swiveled towards the holographic display. The first Terran ship's killed its impeller, the drive signature vanishing from the Relentless's display. A few seconds later, it reappeared. Grant smiled. The first step in his plan, it seemed, had worked just fine. A new drive signature wasn't exactly the same as the first. For one, it was offset by about 45 meters, and two, it was ever so slightly stronger. The fast attack craft couldn't quite match the drive signature of the civilian freighter that it was impersonating. It wouldn't matter. The distinct galactic compact formations would never be able to tell the difference. One by one the edge of the Terran formations went dark, the gaps quickly replaced by the fleet's waiting small crafts. Some were larger vessels, required more than one vessel to fake them. Replicating the drive signatures of only surviving Sling took 4 FACs and 2 light cutters flying in dangerously close formation. And the heavier, vigilant R-class battleships needed 3 FACs apiece. Soon the ships within the formation were powering down their reactors and vanishing from the tack plot. Nothing replaced them. They could hide in the chop left behind by the dreadnought impellers. Stalwart-class dreadnoughts were infamous for their massive drive footprints. The illusion only held for a few carefully calculated angles, examining the fleet by any other point of view, say, from the flag bridge of the Relentless, and it became painfully clear that the Terrans were putting on a show, but the Compact wouldn't be able to tell. They wouldn't see the clusters of FACs and cutters imitating battleships and cruisers. They wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the edge of the vast civilian fleet and a few carefully placed small craft revving up their drives for all they were worth. And they certainly wouldn't catch on to the fact that with the exception of the 7 dreadnoughts, not one of the ships were manned. At least, Grant hoped that they wouldn't. He still wasn't sure if they'd take the bait. "All the slave ships accounted for," reported Yu. "The load is split between the squadron, and the processor banks aren't even close to redlining." "Thank you, old friend," said Grant. "Send out the move orders. Let's see if the Compact takes the bait." TAV Dewdrop Midway. Treaty watched the Compact chase after Grant's phantoms with satisfaction. They'd been utterly fooled, even going so far as to recombine their 2 formations into one to better threaten that they thought was the Terran fleet. "Mind if I duck in?" asked Lael. Spook nodded off just before the gravity cut out, and Webb's getting suited up with Naomi to help with the jump starts. "I need something to keep my mind off the fact that my mate is about to go drifting through open space." "By all means," said Calloway. "We've got the best view on the ship." The backup fusion reactor sped out just enough power to run the main display and passive sensors, in addition to life support and rad shielding. Lael hauled herself over the rear bulkhead and slipped her arms around into 2 0G ladder loops, floating in space. The Nyctra's ears twitched in amusement at the Compact's maneuvers. You can always count on the HFY to make the most straight line approach towards a given solution. Look at them, matching Grant's moves step for step. We're playing them like a fiddle. "There were more than a few clever HFY in Mylar," said Tweety. "Yeah, but none of those were more senior than the High Fist. All young and hungry. By the time one of those crapbags makes a greater overlord, they're fat and ancient, couldn't think their way out of a hairpin turn. Now swap out one of those rats for an APR, and you've got a different story entirely. They like the deception. Some of the stuff they pulled is, Hold up. What's with that vector? Which vector? Asked Cromley. He leaned back over his console and started typing in commands. The one that the third compact super dreadnought had just took. Only held it for about 10 seconds, but it was pretty damn close to a straight line shot back to us. It's probably just a coincidence. Remember what I was just saying. If they've got an LPA running things and we can't assume anything else, there is no such thing as a coincidence. Pull up the sensor logs. Lael's ears were pressed low on his skull with worry. We might have a problem. TAS Relentless Midway. Priority message from Admiral Hughes, sir, said Yu. It came over a tight beam. Put it on the private terminal, said Grant. He missed his implants before the refugee fleet had jumped into Midway. The entire message could have been plucked and played back in his head. He wouldn't have even needed to look away from the TAC plot. Rear Admiral Grant, said Hughes' recorded head. When you received this message, it'll have been 11 minutes since the Galactic Compact launched a heavy cruiser squadron on a ballistic course towards the refugee fleet. Their estimated course has been transmitted along with this message. They have not yet pierced the illusion, but will do so at 14 minutes past the launch unless action is taken. Adjust your formation accordingly. Also, be advised that 98 minutes past their launch, the heavy cruiser squadron will detect the civilian fleet and inform the Galactic Compact commander. At maximum burn, bogies 1 and 2 will still be capable of interception upon our detection. Their approach is inevitable. If we fire on them, we betray our position, and they're too distant for our grazers to penetrate their screens. I was asked to remind you that the survival of the civilian population is paramount, but I've known you for 11 years. You don't need that reminder in the slightest. Do us proud. You out. Looks like the Admiralty wouldn't get a clean, casualty-free escape that they'd hoped for. A pity that. They could have used Grant's dreadnoughts once they made their escape. You, said Grant, I'm passing some coordinates over to your station. Tell the math geeks to find us a new formation to make the charade airtight from 2 angles again. He started to walk back to the TAC plot and then paused. Oh, and Parker, if you're not going to be able to finish those modifications, now's the time to tell me. You're now about as mission critical as it gets. TAV Dewdrop, Midway. Bloody hell, whispered Tweety. Lael was right. I was, asked Lael, ears shooting up with satisfaction, and then a few seconds later they dropped back down. Of course I was. The Admiralty's bouncing around an update on the Type Beam network. 1 squadron of heavy cruisers on a ballistic intercept course. They haven't passed the estimated by a vector, but Flaring should be able to manage something crude. Already on it, said Flaring. The Neji's beak was buried in the navigation console. Computer still whittling down the possibilities, but we've got about an hour and a half until there are scopes. After that, we're royally frecked, said Cromley. We weren't supposed to go active until the compact was good 300 million clicks out of position. That won't even be half as far. Plus, the gate's acting up, said Lael. Every head in the room swiveled to the Nectra. The what? Asked Tweety. The gate, said Lael. Look at those readings you've got pasted on the bottom left corner. Grav spikes every 45 seconds. A periodic light emissions from the rings. Neither of those are supposed to happen. Something's up. She glanced around the surprised room, ears standing straight. You mean you hadn't noticed? TAS Relentless Midway. For the first time in his life, Grant was going to make the chairman's paranoia work to his advantage. The thought made him feel almost giddy, as the fact that the nearest Martian was more than 150 million kilometers away. He'd like to see them try and sink their dirty claws into his squadron now. Parker popped his head out of the access panel and, seeing Grant watching, gave him a thumbs up. Almost there, sir. The tablet's patched in, and most of the physical safeguards have been safely bypassed. We can join the rest of the crew in the FAC as soon as I've cut the redundancies. Thank you, Ensign. You and the rest of the dreadnoughts ready? They have been for some time, sir. None of them had to make quite as many modifications as Parker. Thank you for the update. It's good to know that at least one thing's going our way today. It was just like the chairman to insist that every Terran warship bigger than a light cruiser be built with an override system, albeit a limited one, that could be used by a marshal to wrest away the Terran Alliance fleet from rebel hands. Like any system designed by a committee, it was widely regarded as a broken mess. It couldn't be triggered remotely or turned over to an AI. that would have violated the Arkway law, restricting autonomous spacecrafts up to a certain tonnage. In fact, in order to actually use the damn thing to control the squadron, there needed to be 2 marshals present in every CIC and flag bridge, and both men had to approve every command before it could be executed. Small wonder the system had never been used. Right now, Parker and a score of other engineers across the squadron were busy turning the override into something halfway effective. Grant had plans for the modified tool. Big plans. HAV Mechanica, Midway. "Can we go now, sir?" asked Charles, his voice dripping with sarcasm, as he was still wincing whenever he took a step. "I just want to make sure that I won't get shot for following along with the rest of the fleet. We can stay here and wait for the compact if you desire." "The move order's gone out then?" asked Jenkins. He was holding a rag on his broken nose, trying to keep the blood from leaking onto the zero-G cabin. Billy was staring at him, steadily chewing. "Yes," Charles said. "We're going to swing around and hit the gate from the Blue Star vector. Our squadron's near the back. Then you don't let me stop you." "Thank you, Captain," said Charles. "Ments, get the reactor back up." A grunt echoed through the ship, and a few seconds later the artificial gravity came back online and dropped Jenkins back into his seat. The goat landed primly on all 4 legs. "Liam," said Charles, "drop us in formation right on the dewdrop's rear. Don't want to spend even an extra second in this god-awful solar system." "She's not up yet," said Liam. "Frick! Well, kill the plant or something. Maybe her captain'll think." The man's gaze rested on Jenkins. He seemed to have forgotten what about Walshkin. "So we've done this a few times. We're smugglers. What are we going to do? Arrest us?" "Later, maybe," said Jenkins. "For now, do your frickin' job and help get our squadron jump-started. Might help sway the jury waiting for you at the court-martial." "As if," muttered Charles. The man probably thought that he was being quiet, but Jenkins had always had exceptional hearing. "Ain't nobody managed to catch me yet." Nobody on the small bridge paid much attention to the gate. TAF Dewdrop Midway. Since defecting to the Terran Alliance, Webb had discovered that he loved EVA work. Working outside of the ship's hull with only a thin sheet between himself and the vastness of infinity terrified him in a way that he just couldn't get enough of. It made him feel alive. The effect was the little ruin by his suit's helmet. It pressed down on his ears, nearly flattening them against his face. He caught himself scratching absently at the outside of his helmet more than once since leaving the Dewdrop's airlock. His radio cracked open and Naomi's voice filled his suit. "How's it coming?" she asked. "Almost there," said Webb. 100 meters to go." Webb adjusted his course with a slight burst of his thruster pack. The power conduit secured his belt, but kept him from going off target, but it was easy enough to manage. The Maxwell's hull loomed large in his vision. He feathered the thrusters before he hit the hull, landing with a barely perceptible impact. Webb used magnetic clamps to crawl towards the external access panel, which slid open at the touch. Connecting the conduit took less than 4 seconds, and the safety checks were the work of a moment. "Link established," said Webb. "Tell Calloway that he's fine to fire up." "Roger," said Naomi. "Should be happening any moment now. Feel anything?" Webb's paws were suddenly pulled towards the Maxwell's hull. "Yep. Another flawless jump start. I'm kicking off as we speak." He oriented himself towards the approaching compact squadron as he floated back towards the Dewdrop. They should be entering into the engagement range any second now. If the Terran countermeasures performed as advertised, it would be quite the show. He was rewarded by 6 sharp flashes of light, and he tried and failed to flick his ears into a smile. The moment wasn't really that significant. The compact's suspicions would have been confirmed the moment the first Terran ship fired up the Mat and plant. But Webb felt that at least one person should witness it. Something else caught his eyes, the revolving rings of the distant gate. Normally matte black and invisible to the naked eye, were flickering with a blue light. He couldn't think of any reason why. "Webb," came Calloway's voice, "stop dawdling, get your rear back in the ship. The laboratory's passed out of course for our jump. Fluctuations be damned. I'm afraid that if you're not in here before we go, Lael's gonna skin me alive." She's pacing. He twisted around and triggered his thruster pack. Calloway's words had reminded him that, in his excitement of getting outside the hull, he'd completely forgotten about Lael. And that had been a mistake. His mate hated it when he did an EVA. Get back soon, she was going to be angry. TAF Relentless, Midway. The compact was just beginning to accelerate back towards the civilian fleet when Grant struck. For a brief moment his formation devolved into a barely controlled chaos as the unmanned FACs and cutters that had built the illusion raced into new positions. Hundreds of small craft buzzed around the prows and torpedo-shaped stalwarts, forming the most expansive ablative shield in the history of mankind. Then the dreadnoughts charged. 7 capital ships streaked towards the 4 clustered compact super dreadnoughts. The Terran's acceleration blew well past their stated maximums as they pushed their impellers to the max. Grant felt the acceleration bleed past the dampeners, slamming him into the crash couch. Black spots swam in his vision as he fought to remain conscious. He didn't want to miss a thing. The compact turned to face the threat, halting their advance towards the fleeing civilian fleet. Grant forced his face into a weak smile. That was good. Even if everything else went wrong, he'd still have brought a few precious minutes. Slowly, painfully, the gap between the formations closed and Grant clung to the consciousness for 40 long minutes as the dreadnoughts continued to accelerate. Then, when Grant thought he couldn't stand it any more abuse, the force of crushing on his chest doubled as the Terrans pushed their impeller drives even further. Without his air tube, he would have started to suffocate. Instead, he hovered on the brink of consciousness. Then the weight lifted from Grant could breathe easily again. His FAC had been jettisoned from the Relentless, hopefully without the compact noticing. He'd made it. He'd go watch the show. Compact's grazers lashed out at the oncoming Terran warships, overwhelming the screens and boiling through the layers of small craft and steel. None of Grant's dreadnoughts fired back. They just keep piling on acceleration. By the time the enemy realized the Rear Admiral's intent, it was too late for them to try and dodge. The prow of the Relentless hit the hull of the first compact super dreadnought. The relative velocity between the two ships was 0.35 c, and the dreadnought weighed millions of metric tons. The Terrans didn't need to overload the reactor, or even aim the strikes particularly well. They only needed to manage one glancing hit on each enemy capital ship. All 7 dreadnoughts struck home. From the bridge of Grant's payload-class FAC, there really wasn't much to see. The force of the explosion burnt their sensors out. Alarms blared as their screens struggled to keep a sudden blast of radiation, and the FAC shuddered as debris from the inferno battered the ships. Grant felt a first breach in the hull, could just make out the hiss of the air as it flitted the vacuum of space. At least I managed to save the crews, he thought, and then the spots returned, overwhelming his vision as Grant's world went black. RFS Heartbreaker. Kyla caught herself against the bulkhead as the Heartbreaker translated into system. She glanced around frantically, half expecting a catastrophe to be waiting for her, but her fears were unfounded. The gate translations were trivial for compact-built ships. There was a haunting song playing over the ship's internal speakers. The tune hovered halfway between a mournful dirge and a fearful rallying cry, with the blight trills of hope dancing amongst the minor chords. The voice came over the ship-wide intercom, speaking human common in a trilling accent of the Neji. Our translation from Blue Star was successful, it said. The fleet is regrouping for an immediate second jump. We'll be taking this one even slower. I am now authorized to tell you that we do, in fact, have a long-term course. Over the past 5 years, elements of the Third Fleet have been conducting surveying operations along the fringes of the compact-controlled space. They've compiled quite the list. We're going to shake the compact off, and then we're going to have ourselves a little tour of the galaxy. We'll not drift forever, we'll find ourselves a new home. A weak cheer rang out through the cargo hold. Well, weak by human standards. To Kyla's sensitive ears, it was deafening. She limped through the throng towards the wall display, feeling a sudden pang of self-consciousness as Benjamin cleared a path for her. It vanished as soon as she saw the screen. Squadrons of ships still pouring out of the gate, and a little more than half the arcs had survived. But there were gaps in the orderly formation. Big gaps. Maybe there'd been another catastrophe waiting after all. HAV Mechanica. The Mechanica shuddered as it cleared the gate, even more violently than during the high-speed escape from Sol. The force pressed down on Jenkins's chest, slamming him into the tattered crash couch. He struggled to breathe. The artificial gravity cut out, the lights died, and the inbred emergency lighting kicked in. The comm station went up in sparks, and smoke started to trickle out of the seams of the deck plating. Emergency bulbs shattered one by one. Then finally the weight lifted. Should any of that have happened, choked out Jenkins, his left arm still burning and his nose bleeding again. But at least the blood was falling to the ground. The artificial gravity had stayed on line against all odds. "No," said Charles and Walsh. They shared an awkward glance. Charles broke the silence with an exaggerated cough. "No, it shouldn't have. The gate transition was well below the maximum. It should have been smooth as an escort's—" Boss," interrupted Fingers, "you may want to take a look at the tack plot." Jenkins watched as Charles's eyes defocused and the man's implants kicked in. He started sub-vocalizing his own commands by reflex, then cursed as he remembered that his own implants were still inactive. Instead, he turned on his own still-working console. The system was empty. Well, almost empty. There was a bare handful of impeller signatures speeding away from the gate, but no more. The escaping fleet had been more than 4,000 strong. There should have been a traffic jam, for frick's sakes. "Mance!" bellowed Charles. "Mance, get your sorry rear back out here and fix the goddamn comm arrays. They're going on the fritz again." The deep bass grunt echoed out through the ship. Charles walked to the back of the bridge and slumped against the wall. "They'd better be friendly," said Charles, "'cause I don't think the old girl's got much left in her." "At least one of them had better be the dewdrop," thought Jenkins, "because if I'm stuck on this rusty piece of crap for the rest of my life, I am going to snap." "Meh," said the goat. TAV Dewdrop. The dewdrop's gravity had cut out. Anyone on the bridge who hadn't been strapped in was drifting awkwardly through space. An overjoyed squeal had sent Lael hurrying from the bridge, muttering something about wrangling a spook who wasn't stuck to the ground. The rest of the crew was conducting a hasty survey of the system. "One of the ships seems to be the Mechanica," said Cromley. "At least their impeller signature matches. They're not transmitting anything on the IFF band." "And the rest?" "All from our squadron," replied Cromley, "though the tug's missing some hull. Back third got sliced clean off." "Crap! The crew are still on the flight deck, so ship's prow." "Good. We don't need any more senseless deaths today. Anyone answering our hails?" "Nope," said Tweety, "and it's not likely that they will. Our military comms arrays have survived the jump. The rig like the Machinas is just an antenna bolted onto the hull. With an amount of bleed-through we got—" "Yeah, we're lucky we still have Atmo," said Calloway. "Cromley, you're absolutely sure that our sensors aren't on the fritz? We're not mistaking one short-range picture for a whole system, because there should be a lot more ships than just our squadron." "Nope," said Cromley. "Board's green. The dewdrop took the turbulence like a champ." "So where the hell are we then?" Nobody had an answer. Outside the dewdrop, the small squadron drifted through space. The gate loomed over as deserted system. The expected Terran fleet was nowhere to be found. Nothing was, really. No probes, no stations, no other ships. Hadn't emerged from the jump with the rest of the fleet. Instead, they found themselves alone. End of chapter and end of book 1. I hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to support the channel or the author, all the stuff is down below. And as always, I hope that you guys have a good one, and I'll see you in the next story. Cheers.